Is it all Jews at all time, for all times? Does the text give any reference to which Jews? Certainly Pharisees, Sadducees, scribes, and the Jews who had believed in them sometimes preface or frame those sections, but other times readers are left with the impression that the Jews is some sort of general reference to those who oppose Jesus, and they were interpreted that way. The verses all reflect an ambivalence within Christian doctrine that continues to the present time. How to understand and express Jesus and his adherents, who are characterized as in the new covenant of God, while Jewish believers are described and condemned as being under the old covenant, or the law. It also is the origin of the designations in the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament. Okay, those are the primary sources. I'll give you a couple others. In the 2nd century, Melito, the bishop of Melito of Sardis, the bishop of Smyrna, in a sermon says, "The God has been murdered, the king of Israel has been put to death by an Israelite right hand." In the Middle Ages, there are countless forced conversions, blood libels, expulsions, and massacres. Jews are massacred and exiled from various countries. In the case of one I visited for a while, I lived in England and went to York, which was a royal city at one time, and York Castle in 1190 was a place where Jews had gone to hide and receive the king's protection from knights who were preparing for the Third Crusade, had become a bit overzealous and decided to slaughter the Jews in their hometown. And as they sat inside the tower of the wooden castle under the king's protection, they sought to be released and free and protected, and were given no such protection by the king. And so they made the decision from Rabbi Yamatov of Joigny to kill themselves rather than convert to Christianity. The father of each family killed his wife and children, and then Yom Tov stabbed the men before killing himself. The handful who decided not to kill themselves surrendered to the Crusaders at daybreak on March 17th, and leaving the castle on a promise that they would not be harmed, they were also killed. And then the castle tower, the wooden tower, was burned down. Jews were also blamed for the Black Death, which occurred in the mid-14th century and decimated half the population of Europe. On to Martin Luther, who early in his life sought to construct a theology of how the covenant worked for the Jews, and he felt that the Jews should not be ostracized or punished, but should be sought to convert to Christianity. After 20 years of preaching this, Luther turned his view around and wrote that Jews were no longer the chosen people, but the devil's people. He referred to them with violent and vile language. He wrote a 60,000-word treatise called Von Juden und ihren Lügen, on the Jews and their lies. He advocated setting synagogues on fire, destroying Jewish prayer books, forbidding rabbis from preaching, seizing Jews' property and money, and smashing up their homes. These actions were justified so that these poisonous, envenomed worms would be forced into labor or expelled for all time. Some of his most sinister words are, "We are at fault in not slaying them all." The Boston College Guide to Passion Plays offers a summary. Over the course of time, Christians began to accept that the Jewish people as a whole were responsible for killing Jesus. According to this interpretation, both the Jews present at Jesus Christ's death and the Jewish people collectively and for all time have committed the sin of deicide, or God-killing. Back to Keziman's speech in 1953. His speech opened an area called the Historical Quest for Jesus, and it was the second level of the historical quest. Two scholars who come out of it and influence biblical interpretation for all time are Geza Vermesh and Ed Sanders. Vermesh is a Jewish British scholar, a noted authority on the Dead Sea Scrolls and other ancient works, and a scholar on the life and religion of Jesus of Palestine. He has been described by some of his peers as the greatest Jesus scholar of his time, and his research focused principally on Jesus the Jew as seen in the broader context of the narrative scope of Jewish history and theology. He has moved outside of the covers of the Christian Bible to provide context and order to the life of Jesus. Also, the Methodist trained Ed P. Sanders is a New Testament scholar, and he's one of the principal proponents on the new perspective on Paul. His work on Jesus, Paul, and the law of the Jews has been viewed as successfully refuting Luther's understanding that the Jewish faith was merit-driven or works righteousness-based. Sanders builds his case using rabbinic sources, like Vermesh does, to create a first-century Jewish context that is very different from the one interpreted in the Gospels and the writings of Paul. Jews, through the law, are read to have entered a communion, a living relationship with their God, and find a presence in obedience. Checking off the list of commandments was or is not the goal for Jews. It is a living spiritual relationship through Torah. Jews and Christians are understood now, because of these writings, to possibly have separate covenants with the same God. Christianity's condemnation of Judaism has come under greater question than ever before for historical reasons, in addition to moral or ethical concerns. And I'd like to close and add that John Hagee, who is a current Christian pastor and a tremendous proponent of Israel through his collections of money, it preaches on TV now the separate covenant, the separate salvation approach for Jews and Christians, and he reinterprets Paul based on the kind of trickle-down we have seen since Kezimen's speech and the Holocaust. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Blackwell. Next, we will hear from Elena Eskridge-Kozmach. She is an assistant professor of history and will address the views and the major directions of Hitler's policy towards Slavs and Gypsies.
Good afternoon. First of all, thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to talk about the major directions of Hitler's policy towards Slavs, because this policy is and these attitudes are very important parts. I represent, and originally I'm from the country, from Belarus, which suffered greatly during the Second World War, and I'll give you only one figure before I'll start my presentation, that before the beginning of the Second World War, in 1939, Belarus had 9 million people. Almost every, after the Second World War, 2,250,000 people were killed. And it's only one direction of Hitler's policy. Hitler's policy towards Slavs was very important part of Hitler's Nazi program, and the major directions of this policy were outlined by Hitler in his famous book Mein Kampf. Dated back to the 1925, when Hitler was talking about the superiority of Aryan race, he told in his famous book about the necessity of the living space or Lebensraum for Aryan race, and the major directions was eastwards. The major directions was Slavic countries, such countries as Poland, Czechoslovakia, Belarus, Ukraine, Baltic countries, and western part of Russia. According to Hitler's understanding, Slavs were considered as subhumans. They were considered as people who were eligible only for servitude, and elimination of Slavs or deportation of them were important parts of Hitler's program. The expansion eastwards was important for German territories even from the Middle Ages. And when the Second World War started, the major directions of this plan were outlined in the famous plan called Ost or East. Unfortunately, we do not have the original of this plan, but economic part of this plan was presented during Nuremberg Tribunal, and several supplements to this plan were also presented at the Nuremberg Tribunal after the end of the Second World War. According to this plan, according to the major directions towards Slavic population, there were three major things. First of all,